So I want to spend another minute just talking about that because Esther Perel really emphasizes the separateness component in there. And I think that that's important because most of the time the assumptions in our culture around relationships emphasize closeness. They emphasize like to become one, soulmates, like this transcendent kind of spiritual process that can happen that bonds them and glues them together in a way. And so I think that our common knowledge, understanding of relationships has been that society thinks that the closer we are, the better the relationship is, period. And that has done a large disservice for our independent needs, our needs to be individuals, to be different than each other, to not be exactly the same. And so society has emphasized closeness as the ideal, as the safest form of a relationship. And that might have been really important in previous generations, where closeness was much more vital for survival, that you had to be very close. You couldn't have much disagreement. You had to be on the same page because, you know, it was like life and death out there. Now, especially with much more female independence and the ability to be independent financially, separateness is a value that needs to be integrated into a relationship. And couples need to talk about that. How much separateness in our relationship am I okay with? How much closeness am I okay with? Where's my balance on that? So I usually encourage couples before they get married, as part of a premarital conversations, is to talk about that. What are your expectations around your partner having different opinions than you? What about your partner doing things different than you? Do you have to go on vacations together? Do you have to always then agree on where you go? Does that mean that you don't get to go to, you know, the place that you've been dying to go because you always have to compromise? Is that okay? Could you have a separate trip by yourself? Or how would that influence the relationship? How would everybody feel about that? So we're going to spend more time also talking about those dynamics in the solutions section. The next concept that we need to go over is, what is good sex? So first of all, how do you even define sex? When you have a couple in your office, or even an individual, we cannot assume that they have the same understanding of what sex means when they say it and when we say it. When most people say sex, they really mean penile vaginal intercourse. And that's all they mean. And if you remember back in the 90s, that's how Bill Clinton thought of it. It's only penetrative vaginal intercourse that actually counts as sex, not oral sex or anything else. But then, of course, there's a flip side of that, where a lot of people would define sex inclusive of oral sex, maybe with maybe dry humping is even a part of how they might define sex, with or without orgasm or ejaculation. So it's really important that we understand that most people are talking about sex with a focus on the penis, the orgasm, and their performance. And that's how they've traditionally understood what sex means. If there's not a male orgasm, did sex even happen? Yeah, people might debate that. What what I would like to encourage clients to do is to expand their definition of sex and sexuality and have it much more focused on pleasure, intimacy, and connection, not about whether or not orgasms happened or at what time they happened, that erections were even present. We're focused on pleasure and connection, not on the mechanical or performative act of completing sex. So that's something that we really need to address early with clients as well. And we don't want to assume anything. You know, when they say, "Oh, we had sex last night," what does that mean? What do they think that means? What do you think that means when you first hear that? We need to be clear on that. So the other part of that is, how do you define good sex then? So if we're struggling to even just be on the same page about what sex means and have a common vocabulary, what does good sex mean? So Barry McCarthy and Michael Metz were longtime writing associates and research associates. Michael Metz unfortunately passed away a few years ago, but Barry McCarthy continues to write, and he does it with his wife, Emily McCarthy, now. And so Metz and McCarthy came up with the good enough sex model. And this was their solution for the common focus of sexuality with couples being their focus on performing, being perfect, and that they have had all of these fears of being inadequate during sex because they had to do it a certain way, or they had to perform a certain way, they had to act a certain way, things had to happen at the right time or a certain time. And so there was an enormous amount of pressure then that Metz and McCarthy were seeing on couples that really seemed to hinder their perceptions of healthy, satisfying sex, because they seemed to think, and perhaps this was influenced by pornography to some extent, that porn sex was the ideal sex, that was the kind of sex that we should all be having, or we should try to get towards having that kind of sex. And that kind of sex is just not going to happen in real life. In pornography, what our brains don't fill in is that they are filming that over maybe a couple days. They are getting rehydrated in between. They are probably using maybe Viagra or other chemicals or drugs to help support that level of kind of performance. You know, in terms of what people look like, you know, the standard models in pornography, you know, just make it look like beautiful sex, is as if that's what good sex looks like, is that it needs to look good, or maybe from a voyeuristic perspective, look good according to some kind of perception. So the good enough sex model was really about, let's try not to think that amazing sex is what we're trying to get every time, or like mind-blowing transcendental sex is what we're trying to get every time, because it's just not for most people. Most people really just don't have that kind of time to invest in that. If they can, that's awesome, but they're probably not seeing us in therapy. So good enough sex model, one of the components is that it says that about in healthy sex lives, so however they're defining healthy there, high level of couple sexual satisfaction, in the healthiest of sex lives, there is still about 15% of the time that the sex is not going to go according to plan. So basically, this idea that's almost like an 80-20 rule of even the greatest sex lives in human history, still only are great or what we expect 80% of the time. And that's about as high as we can get according to their model. So that we're trying to normalize the disappointment maybe sometimes that people experience in it not going according to plan. We're trying to help them adjust a bit of their expectations or what their emphasis or priorities are during the sexual activity. So this is an important model for couples to not try to have sex that's kind of unattainable or unreasonable and then feel dissatisfied about their sex life because it's not comparing well to this porn kind of model of what they hope it looks like. And Angela is going to send along the Good Enough Sex Model article, the original one that they did in 2007. So the next sex therapy concept to talk about is trauma. And I'm going to let this video talk about 3 ways that trauma changes the brain. And then we'll talk a little bit about how that relates to sex therapy specifically.
To a trauma survivor, it can feel like the whole world has changed. Life in general often seems scarier and more menacing at every turn, because when trauma occurs, the brain changes. In fact, there are 3 key differences between the brain of someone who suffers from PTSD and the brain of someone who does not, according to Dr. Bessel van der Kolk.
One is that the threat perception system is enhanced, so that people see danger where other people see manageable stuff. And this is not in the cognitive part of the brain, this is sort of the core perceptual part, the very primitive part of the brain. So the primitive part of the brain that basically is in charge of making sure that your body is okay becomes a fear-driven brain. So that's number 1. Number 2 is that your filtering system, a little higher up in your brain, that helps you to distinguish between what is relevant right now and what you can dismiss, gets messed up. So things that other people may sort of ignore or not pay attention to, you start paying attention to it, which makes it very hard to focus on what's going on right now. So you get into the whole issue of it being difficult to fully engage with ordinary situations. The third one is that the self-sensing system, which runs through those midline structures of the brain that various people probably have talked about on your program already, that midline structure that's devoted to your experience of yourself gets blunted. And that's probably a defensive response, because when you are in a state of terror, you feel it in your body. You feel it in terms of heartache and gut-wrenching feelings, and so your body feels bad. And so as a way of coping with that, some people start taking drugs to sort of dampen that system, and other people sort of naturally find a way of dampening that internal response to yourself. But when you start dampening your response to yourself, you also dampen the response to pleasure, sensuality, excitement, connection, stuff like that. So it's very deep in the core organism of human beings.
With a deeper understanding of what's happening in the brain following a traumatic experience, we can apply more targeted interventions that can help patients heal. And in this week's webinar with Dr. van der Kolk, we'll get into much more about trauma's impact on the brain, including how trauma changes.
Okay, so let's just kind of integrate that into a little bit more of sex therapy. So if we have a client who has had a sexual trauma experience in their past, and we know that their threat perception is going to be enhanced. So sometimes we might call that like hypervigilance, hypersensitivity, or really more accurately, vigilance and sensitivity based on experiences that the body has had. And so it amps up the threat detection and perception system, which means that any sexual cues from a partner may be perceived as a threat right away before there's even a further discussion about what sexual activity might happen. It could be even a look, and it feels like a threat, and then it probably is going to initiate maybe a bit of a withdrawal response from that threat, which is then going to impact the other person as a sense of rejection, even though it's not a rejection of them. It is the trauma survivor trying to figure out a way to deal with the emotions that are coming up in their body at that time. So then hard to focus and engage. Well, there's a book called Magnificent Sex by Peggy Kleinblatz, also out of Ottawa. And she has distilled her years of research about what makes magnificent sex. What does that actually look like? And her two big themes were communication and presence. So presence being a vital component for magnificent sex, and even less than magnificent sex. If trauma makes it hard to engage or be in the present of that, and the system is even experiencing a threat around it, then that's going to take away from any advances towards sexuality. That's going to appear to be a very threatening environment, and might look like an avoidant or a withdrawal response from it. The self-sensing system, is also blunted, which means that sometimes with trauma survivors, they have figured out a way of dissociating some of their bodily experiences from their conscious brain. And so they may not quite be as connected to their bodies, in which case sexuality is going to be an issue around some of that, because it doesn't feel totally connected with the body, or it might actually go into a dissociative experience to tolerate the sexual activity as well, which is kind of re-traumatizing around sexuality. So trauma, yeah, obviously is a big one to think about with sex therapy, and when we see clients almost having an aversive reaction to sexuality or to touch, we probably need to talk about trauma and history, and be able to explore that.